Okay. Hi, everyone. I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Courtney Schultz. She's a professor here in natural resource policy and governance. She brings her background in political science, legal analysis, and biological science to inform her research focus, which places an emphasis on the intersection of policy and science. Currently, her and her students are working on investigating the governance of landscape-scale forest restoration projects, the integration of climate change and forest planning, aspects of fire management policy, and many other things. I couldn't even begin to describe them all. And with that, please welcome me in joining Dr. Courtney Schultz.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for coming, and thanks especially to my students who listen to me every day. I really appreciate you coming back for more. So I just got tenure a couple weeks ago. And I decided, since this is a multidisciplinary audience, and I know that there are students in here from multiple disciplines and faculty from my department and others who have never really heard about what I do, that I just wanted to give you an overview of my research program. So I'm not actually going to talk about any specific projects today in great detail or my findings in a lot of detail. I'm kind of going to talk about the big picture of what I do and how I came to do what I do. And I changed the title of my talk because Ben made me give him that title like 6 months ago. So, but I'm going to talk about my general program, which is really sort of about how we move towards these adaptive governance institutions. Before I get started, just because we're all from different backgrounds, and I think one of the biggest barriers to interdisciplinary work is that sometimes we don't understand each other's jargon, and I just wanted to clarify some terms. So when I talk about policy, this is a really broad term, and it refers to anything government does or doesn't do. And so it might include law, but it could also include internal agency policy. One thing to remember is that policy generally has a formal quality to it. So it could be internal agency guidance, but it's different than like internal norms about decision making. When I talk about law today, I don't think I'm going to talk about any constitutional provisions, although these are still really relevant in natural resource policy. I might talk about some statutes from Congress, but I'm also going to talk about administrative law, which is the law that agencies write to interpret the laws from Congress. Administrative law is known as rules and regulations, and so I am going to talk about the Forest Service's new planning rule today. So I just wanted to make sure we all know what I'm talking about there. Governance is it's an even bigger bucket than policy, and it refers to sort of everything we have in place as a society to deal with how we manage or make decisions or interact with a resource. So, for example, when I talk about forest governance, if I was talking just about policy, it might be just the laws that are in place, but when we talk about governance, we're talking about other things like all the different ways that stakeholders have a way to have a say in the management of the resource, all the different places they might exercise their voice or have power within the system, all the different venues where they might exercise that power. And then institutions are sort of those norms and rules and procedures that guide how we make decisions and interact. So I'll use all of these terms, and then of course these are all just the jargon of my discipline. So I just wanted to give you a sense of what I'm going to be talking about. It's just an outline today. I'm going to talk a little bit about my interest and background. I'm going to talk a little bit about public land management, some of the bigger picture theoretical considerations that guide my work, and then I'm going to talk about my research in 4 main areas. So we'll go through each of those areas, and then some future directions that I'm excited about. So just a little bit about me. I have a very interdisciplinary background. I did my undergrad at Stanford. I started out as a biology major, really focused on ecology. I've always loved biology. I was a high school AP biology teacher for years. But I went to India after my second year for 3 months, and I got really interested in world systems theory and dependency theory, and essentially questions about why parts of the world were so poor, why we were exporting our sustainability issues in certain ways and patterns. And I ended up studying international trade and development theory, learning Spanish, learning Swahili, focusing on third world countries at the time. I went to work, this is during my Outward Bound years, I went to work after college for Outward Bound in Montana on our national forest. I also led all these overseas trips, service learning trips, mostly in the developing world. Study abroad trips and high school summer trips. Ended up doing a master's in conservation. It was kind of an interdisciplinary master's in conservation biology, law, and public policy. And at the time, I just really wanted to stay a high school biology teacher. But I got really interested in how science gets translated into policy. I did my master's work on the intersection of Western scientific knowledge and indigenous knowledge and natural resource management. It was a professional paper. I didn't do a research degree. And I was really interested in international development issues, but my time working on our national forests made me realize how passionate I am about our public lands, and that I wanted to start my research program working somewhere where I lived, where I'm a citizen, where I participate every day. And so the first part of my career has been very focused on domestic policy, and I imagine it'll grow outwards from there, but that's mostly what I'm going to talk about today. When I went to do my doctorate at the University of Montana, I wanted to focus on that science, policy, and law interface. They have a great law school there. They have a good policy program. And I was looking at how the Forest Service does large-scale conservation for wildlife populations, what the law compels them to do, what the science says they should be doing, and then how all of that interacts, how we could make recommendations about improving that. So that's still one of my major focus areas today, is that intersection of science and policy. And then I look more broadly at the design of our institutions to support our current management goals. I'm here in this applied department and college, and so a lot of my work is designed to be really relevant to managers, and I'm interacting with managers all the time, and policymakers and stakeholders all the time, to make sure that my work has that applied relevance. So just to talk a little bit about US public lands, they're a big part of our country, but in the West they're an even bigger part, almost half of the land base. In some states like Nevada, they're over 80% of the land, and about a quarter of them are national forests. So 200 million acres, that's like twice the size of the state of Montana. It's a really huge chunk of land. And these lands came at a tremendous cost and investment of the nation. They're really unique to our history and the history of colonization in North America. So I think they're a really critical part of our legacy, and there's ongoing debate about our public lands. We really want these public lands to be a lot of things for different people, which makes their management really contentious and I think really interesting. But we set aside a lot of these lands to be managed by the federal government, because particularly our national forests, because we were worried about a race to the bottom among the states, about the influence of special interests and short-term economic development. So there's this legal history for national forests of a multiple use mandate. And basically what that is Congress saying, hey, Forest Service, go out and manage the national forest for everything everyone could possibly want out of them. Good luck. And they basically didn't give the Forest Service a whole lot more guidance than that. So there's this great quote from a political scientist, Theodore Lowy, says, politics always flow to the point of discretion. And he basically means the political battle, the political fights are going to come down to where the hard choices are made. And for our public lands, those are made by the agencies. There were a bunch of things that happened in the 60s and 70s that made clear that the Forest Service was largely managing for commodity production and extraction. They were really managing for timber production. And as sort of societal demands for national forests, as maybe overproduction became clear, Congress, other things happened, right? Clear cutting got outlawed. There were these national controversies. Congress decided they needed to change the law. So the National Forest Management Act, NFMA, is sort of the overarching law for the Forest Service today. And it still says do multiple use with some sideboards, don't destroy soil and water quality and biodiversity long term. And that's still the guiding policy. But I think what's really important is that starting in the 1990s, the Forest Service moved towards ecosystem-based management for lots of reasons, and we could go into that history. But they made this profound transition from being an agency largely staffed by road engineers and foresters to a much more integrated, holistic approach to land management. So really from commodity production, and that's what the agency was organized to do, more towards ecosystem-based management. And I want to tell you a little bit more about ecosystem-based management because this is fundamentally what we're still trying to do today. We're still trying to figure out how to do this well. So this really refers to focusing more on conditions left behind on the landscape than on commodities extracted. We often are talking about working more at scales that are relevant for landscape kinds of processes. We also acknowledged when we started doing ecosystem-based management just the changing and complex nature of ecosystems, and that we can't know everything about them, and that they're constantly going to be doing unexpected things. And so we need to be learning through management through an adaptive management process. So the whole movement towards ecosystem-based management really emphasized monitoring and adaptive management. And I just want to point out, this is not just the Forest Service. This is going on around the world. All of our federal land management agencies started to pick this up in the last part of the 20th century, but this terminology gets used in a lot of different contexts in environmental governance. There's also a really big emphasis on collaboration and the role of stakeholders when we're talking about ecosystem-based management, and that's for a lot of different reasons. One is because the scale at which you approach problems has big implications for who gets a say, who has a right to be involved, how you affect communities. But it's also because if we're trying to do multiple use, there's no magic emergent quality of the landscape that's going to tell us what's the right mix of things we're going to manage for in any location. Communities have to be involved in helping to figure out how to set the goals. And so we started to move away from this paradigm of scientific management where we said technical experts can figure out what to do on the landscape, more towards community involvement. And communities in the 90s started demanding much more of a voice in forest management. There's been some cool research that shows that the language of restoration and resilience is really just an outgrowth of the same ideas as ecosystem management. So ecosystem management was sort of the guiding principles for the Forest Service in the 90s, but people have looked at restoration and resilience and ecosystem services and community collaborative restoration, and the literature tells us that we're still talking about the same stuff. We're still talking about the same basic ideas. What's really interesting to me is that we haven't really changed policies or laws to support this huge transformation in what we're trying to do on these lands. And so that's largely what I study, is how are we going to get there? There's a lot of literature that talks about the need to move more towards adaptive governments. Hold up, let's talk about this cool blue bird. I know you're wondering. Just saw it in India. It's a vertebrate's flycatcher, so cool. Okay. Back, focus. So adaptive governance. There's all this literature that says we need more adaptive governance institutions. We need institutions that can work more effectively, be more flexible at different scales, that can integrate better across scales. So we might be talking about geographic scales. We might be talking about scales at which our institutions are organized. We need to link those things better. We need more effective learning and adaptive management. We need more nested governance systems, so we might organize at local levels, but then we might need some kind of meta-level system that organizes what people are doing more locally. We need more networked systems. So there's all this literature that says this is where we need to go, and what I study is how do we actually get there in the context of our current laws, of our Constitution, given the path dependence of all of our organizations, how are we actually going to get where we want to go? And then how can we promote this movement towards more adaptive institutions through policy change? I've been reading a lot about scale lately and thinking a lot about this because the scales at which we are planning are really shifting. So there's almost an infinite number of scales that you could argue are relevant for planning. If you're thinking about wildlife populations, it depends on the species, right? What's the right scale for planning? If you were thinking about community sustainability, you might be planning at a different scale. There might be a scale that's relevant because of where you have your expertise organized. There are all kinds of ecological processes that might inform that. And they all have implications for who's going to be involved and who's going to get differential levels of power in your governance system. So there's a lot of interesting literature on scale. And one of the things that I'm finding really fascinating right now is that all of our planning concepts, let's just take resilience, for example, that we say is guiding federal land management. Resilience is a boundary concept in the sense that it's got enough meaning that we can organize around it, but probably every single one of us means something different when we say we're managing for forest resilience. And what I think is so interesting about this is because you can put these goals into policy and everyone's like, yeah, resilience, you know, I can kind of, scientific community can organize around it. Same with like watersheds or landscape. You know, we never define what we mean by these, but people can organize around these concepts. But then when you pin down their meaning and you really operationalize it, you can create a lot of debate and it can be very contentious. And that's kind of where the Forest Service is right now, is that they actually have to operationalize these terms. And then all this debate will sort of surface because it's like, no, that's not what I meant by that. So it's really interesting that these are kind of our guiding concepts right now. And there's a lot of interesting challenges around scale. Can we match our institutions with the spatial scales we want to manage and make decisions at? You know, can we find scale-specific comparative advantages? Are there things we should be doing at more regional scales, and how do we link those to things we're doing at more local scales? All of these things are kind of informing my thinking right now, and a lot of my questions are around how do we adapt our policies and our organizational structures to give us more flexibility to address these challenges more effectively. So just to summarize before I go into actual research projects I'm working on, these are the primary things that I look at. So I look at how these concepts that have a strong grounding and usually a strong history in the biophysical sciences, like adaptive management or ecological integrity or restoration or climate change adaptation, how do they get translated through policy? So how do we write them into law, and then what does that mean? How does the law guide what we actually do? How are they affected by other governance institutions? How are they put into practice by agencies and their partners? And then how do we move more towards adaptive governance in the context of our current legal structures and policies? And how can we promote change to where we want to go through policy change? So those are kind of the big picture things I focus on. So I want to switch gears now and tell you about kind of 4 big aspects of my research program. And I'm going to try to give a little shout out to all of my students so you can hear a little bit about what they're doing too as we go through this. So one big area of emphasis for me has been monitoring and adaptive management. This came out of my dissertation work. I looked at how the Forest Service is asked to and how they plan for wildlife populations across jurisdictional boundaries, across project boundaries, and a lot of what I heard was about the need for more monitoring and adaptive management, and the challenges of building it into planning documents. Today, adaptive management is pretty ubiquitous in policy guidance. It's in Department of Interior policy guidance. It's sort of the main thing the Forest Service says they're doing in forest planning. It kind of means everything to everyone, even though there's like 40, 50 years of literature about what the scientific community means by adaptive management. Sometimes agencies will use it just to mean as things change, so will we. It can be very, very flexible. And so one of the first projects that I wanted to do was look at the legal challenges of building adaptive management into our plans and processes, because our laws were not designed to do this. Nothing about our law was designed to be iterative or adaptive. So one of my first projects when I got here was to do this review of these planning documents up here that all say they're doing adaptive management, large-scale plans like the EIS for the Pinedale Anticline, oil and gas exploration and extraction, the Rocky Mountain National Park elk and vegetation management plan, planning for salmon recovery on the Columbia River. These all say that adaptive management are foundational to what they're going to do. And so one of the things I wanted to do was do an analysis of all the case law around adaptive management and then these plans and how they actually built it in and figure out what works and what doesn't. So we did some interesting analysis of this and found that adaptive management politically can get really co-opted as a way to sort of say, trust us, you know, we're going to adaptively manage and things will be cool and we'll monitor and fix things if they get bad, right? And so you can spin adaptive management in a lot of different ways, and it really depends on where do you set trigger points and how are things enforceable and what are you going to do in the meantime and what's the status quo and what environmental baselines do you use and what's your data look like that you're going to collect to inform your decisions. And we wrote some papers on adaptive management that are now used in agency trainings about how you can use triggers to enforce what you commit to doing. But we really found that it's very hard to enforce monitoring or keep agencies to their promises given the nature of our administrative law system. So it's actually almost impossible unless the Endangered Species Act is in play. So this is a really interesting question that I'll get back to someday, is how would you redesign our administrative law system to support this kind of planning? I'll figure that out maybe later. So, and then I'll tell you, so anyway, that was a project we worked on, and I'll tell you that my student James Garland right now is looking at these large-scale collaborative restoration NEPA documents. There's one down in Arizona that like covers 10 years of activity over almost 1 million acres. It's the biggest project level environmental impact statement that's ever been written. So he's looking at, because he wants to go to law school, how do we actually do adaptive planning in project level documents? And then my student Alex Pitch, she graduated. She was really interested in how can we increase monitoring capacity at the field level by supporting citizen science programs. And so she did these case studies of places where the Forest Service does citizen science to increase their monitoring capacity with high school students. So that was a pretty cool project that she's working on publishing right now. Along these same lines, this is all part of the same monitoring adaptive management bucket, are these new planning regulations. So for the first time in 30 years, the Forest Service wrote new regulations that guide how they're going to do planning. So I told you the National Forest Management Act sets very broad sideboards for what you're going to do in forest management, but it's really the planning regulations where the rubber hits the road. And these new planning regulations say that ecological integrity is the guiding concept of forest management. And one of the first things, it actually says that the Forest Service must maintain and restore ecological integrity across its lands. And it's not clear to what extent you can compromise ecological integrity. So one of the first things that we did with my PhD student, Zach Wurzbach, was we wrote a paper about the history of this concept and how it's been applied by other agencies. It's actually being used as a guiding concept to guide all the monitoring for the National Park Service, for the BLM, for Parks Canada, and by agencies around the world. So I'll talk a little bit more about that, but the concept of ecological integrity has a pretty deep history, and it incorporates a commitment to maintaining native biodiversity, both for its intrinsic value, but also as an indicator of resilience, but it's basically saying we're not going to manage for resilient degraded landscapes. We're going to manage for resilient landscapes that are within their natural range of variation and have a native biodiversity component. So that's kind of what we're aiming for right now on national forests. And one thing that's really interesting about ecological integrity, because the Forest Service has to use the best available science to inform their planning, is that the best available science does not tell you what ecological integrity looks like on any landscape. It says you need to have a deliberative process that integrates managers and scientists in a place on priority ecosystems to operationalize ecological integrity. And that's the best available science. You actually have to deliberate and figure out how to make your planning components and your monitoring for ecological integrity relevant in a location, management relevant and understandable for your stakeholders, and capture the primary drivers and stressors in that landscape. So since this is sort of the guiding concept for forest management, it also guides all of their wildlife planning. My student Summer Grimes looked at how this was getting interpreted and operationalized in the Sierras on their early, their national forests that were early adopters of this planning rule. They had 256 sensitive species on 3 national forests, in addition to all of the listed and candidate species under the Endangered Species Act. So she was looking at how do you plan for those species and how do you link it to how you're operationalizing ecological integrity. And then because this is a pretty enormous shift for the Forest Service, and there are all kinds of other parts of the regulations that are pretty significant, the Washington office of the Forest Service asked us to help them study organizational learning as they implement this rule. And so my student Gwen Rico with basically all the students in my lab. We helped lead the planners workshop that brought together all the planners to have conversations about innovations and best practices and lessons learned. And then Gwen did a series of interviews really looking at organizational learning. And we are working on finishing her thesis right now. My PhD student, Zach Wurzbach, he was contracted through the Colorado Forest Restoration Institute and the Ecological Restoration Institute at Northern Arizona University. We were asked by the Washington office to figure out how do you do multi-scale monitoring for ecological integrity. And so Zach was on point for this project for us. We did over 100 interviews. And we led 4 statewide workshops where we brought in all kinds of state and NGO and science partners and Forest Service teams to basically say, how do we monitor for ecological integrity and how do we do it at different scales? What kinds of data sets are available? And what Zach looked at for his PhD research that he's writing up now, he's using this knowledge management literature that really looks at all the tensions between delivering and using and translating science, and there's not a lot of literature on how this happens inside public organizations. And so he's looking at that, and some of the things he's found is that we have very mismatched incentives for monitoring and for knowledge management at different scales of the organization. We have different capacities at different levels of the organization. And so he's writing a lot right now about how we need to rethink organizational structures if we're going to try to do multi-scale monitoring for ecological integrity. Another cool thing that we came across is that there are some huge data sets that both partners and groups internal to the Forest Service, like FIA, have available that could help with this. But there really aren't the processes or structures in place to share that information or use it. And so that's part of what we were trying to inform with this project. All right, another area of my work is very near and dear to my heart because right after my PhD, I got hired by the Forest Service for a year on a presidential management fellowship. I went and worked on Arizona, on the Coconino National Forest, on the largest restoration project in the country. And right when I got that job, this new law passed, the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program. And I ended up getting really interested. So I was hired to basically lead their big collaborative forest restoration project down there. It's the biggest one in the country. And I was only there for a year. But this area of policy on national forests is changing in some pretty fascinating ways. So this is one area where we're actually seeing some institutional and policy change, and it's kind of fascinating. CFLRP, the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program, is a new authority. It's a new law from Congress. And then there's also a policy change to the way the Forest Service's budget structure is struck. Now, budgets are boring, right? You guys all just were like, oh no, budgets. But budgets can have huge effects on what people do, right? Because like it's Congress telling agencies, here's what you need to spend money on. And stakeholders came to the Forest Service and said, we want you to restructure your budget to support landscape level planning. And that new budget approach is called the Integrated Resource Restoration Budget Pilot. So that's going on. So there's a lot of policy change in this area. So some of the stuff that I've been doing is very early on. I wrote an overview of the CFLRP, the program, its history, how we got there. I basically argued that it's a novel policy approach because it's the first time that we have taken money off the top of the Forest Service's budget and said people now need to compete for it. And you need to show, if you want this money to do a project, that you're a good investment because you have social license to do restoration, you have a clear ecological need, and you have the economic capacity to get it done. And we're going to let an outside group, a federal advisory committee, select projects. So we're going to take all the decision making out of the Forest Service, give it to this outside committee, and we're actually going to prioritize where we make investments. We're going to say, we can't make everyone winners anymore, so we're going to have some winners and losers, places that we think are real investments. A competitive prioritization process like that has not really happened on national forest lands before. So a really cool new policy. I did a project looking at, how people, it's the first policy to require monitoring, and you can put as much money into monitoring and adaptive management as you want. So I did a project looking at what people were planning on doing. My master's student, Hannah Bergman, working with Tony and CFRI, has been doing a comparative case study analysis of the projects in Colorado, the one on the Front Range and the one over on the Uncompahgre Plateau. And she built a framework to sort of say, what are the factors that affect how much a group actually can work with the Forest Service and influence what they're doing. So she's finishing up her thesis right now. Now, CFLRP started in 2010, so just keep it in the back of your mind. It's going on. We weren't ready to study it. We were writing about it, trying to let everyone know we cared. But then meanwhile, this new budget approach got passed, the integrated resource restoration. And this was really exciting for me because I think the second year I was here, Congress passed this new budget, and it was meant to basically incentivize the agency to plan in a much more interdisciplinary way, plan at landscape scales, and give them the flexibility to do all the pieces of restoration. So not just, do, like, one of the things that was happening was they would plan with collaborators, and then they wouldn't get all the pots of money they needed to implement the project. And so they'd say, well, we can do this piece and we can do that piece, but we can't do the roads rehabilitation piece, or we can't do the aquatic restoration piece. And it was really pissing off stakeholders. And so this is one reason why stakeholders kind of said, we need a much more flexible budget structure so we can do all the parts of restoration. And so Congress, when they changed the Forest Service's budget structure, because they don't usually feel like the Forest Service budgetarily is as accountable as they want them to be, they said, we want you to hire someone to do a third-party review of this. And because of some of my connections through CFLRP, the Forest Service and stakeholders came to me and said, would you do this? And so this was a really cool project for me for 3 years, funded by the Washington office and requested by Congress. We did 3 years and 3 phases of work, over 60 interviews with Forest Service staff, where we basically said, your budget's changed structure. How is it affecting strategic planning? Is it making you think about where your priorities are? Is it making you plan at larger scales? Is it doing what we thought it would do? We surveyed over 1,200 staff members. I went on huge road trips one summer all over the West to go meet with partners and people in location in these workshops. We were going to DC and briefing on the Hill and at the department twice a year. So this was really interesting for me, and we found some really cool stuff. We found that, so this is one project where I might tell you guys a little bit about findings, but we found that the budget structure, because it was now flexible, you couldn't have like individual program managers going off with their wildlife biology checkbook and their vegetation management checkbook and their forest products checkbook. Everyone had to sit around the table and say, what are we going to do with this huge pot of money? And they actually had to deliberate and convince each other what the real priorities were. And it helped them focus on landscapes. And because they didn't have to worry about what was going to come in terms of their budget lines the following years, they could make longer term commitments to programs of work. Now, that was the good part of it. I will tell you in our survey that we had like a third of people say it was awesome, and a third of people said it was terrible, and a third of people were like, I don't care, I don't even know what you're talking about. And that was year 2 of implementation. But we did see some profound changes to strategic planning. We saw some negative impacts, some positive impacts to different programs. We saw a lot about performance measurement, and that if you change the structure of the budgets, which tell people what to do, and you say, now your budget's flexible, then they start paying attention to what they have to measure at the end of the year, what their targets are at the end of the year. And so you could say, hey, you have a flexible budget, but I need this many board feet of timber, and I need this many watersheds moved to a condition class, and I need this many acres treated. And of course, they're going to make sure that they allocate their budget to get those targets met. So we had a lot of conversations with the agency and Congress and OMB about performance measurement. But one thing, just one of my take-homes from this is, while it's got its problems and it would need a lot of oversight if it continues, over half of line officers after just 2 years of implementation said that this budget change had improved their ability to prioritize and integrate across their resource areas. And I just wanted to share this with you in a little bit more detail, because it's these kinds of internal agency incentives and structures that can really change behavior, even more than policy. I think you could have passed a policy that's like, sit around the table and integrate, and it wouldn't have happened. And then you change the budget and people are like, oh, okay, we got to talk to each other. So back to CFLRP, I think because of our work on this, we're now in the 8th year of the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program. We just got asked last month by the Forest Service, with real impetus and energy from the external stakeholder CFLRP coalition, to do a comprehensive policy analysis of this program and how it's worked. And when we were talking to the Forest Service leadership about the CFLRP, they said, hey, could you also analyze this other restoration thing we're trying to do, the Joint Chiefs Landscape Restoration Partnership, which is a joint partnership with NRCS that basically funds fuels, water protection, and wildlife habitat restoration work on these landscapes that are kind of mixed national forest and private land. So another unique program that's competitive, that allocates money competitively. And this is the stuff I really love to do, is this kind of policy analysis. How is this policy working? What has it really changed? And then what's the next generation of policy going to look like? So I don't know why, but we agreed to do something like 150 interviews and a massive survey basically in the next 4 months or something. But I'm going to be a little frantic, but it's just such a cool opportunity, and we're really trying to inform the upcoming legislative cycles around the Farm Bill, which is part of the reason why we're on kind of a tight timeline. But my PhD student, Kat McIntyre, will be leading the CFLRP part of this, and Laren Cyphers is going to do the Joint Chiefs stuff for her master's, and we have a whole team with the University of Oregon working on this. So at least we'll have sort of like companionship in the madness, I figure. And we're going to do a large survey. We're going to do over 150 interviews. We're going to do a bunch of remote policy workshops with stakeholders to basically say, what if we change policy like this? What do you think about how that would work? And kind of make some of these evaluations. Some of the questions we're going to focus on: what's the added value of these new authorities? Are they getting us to plan at landscape scales? Are we finding efficiencies? What are the persistent barriers? What help groups really be successful and compete for this money well? And then what's our next generation of collaborative restoration policy look like? So a third area that I'm working on is climate change vulnerability assessment and adaptation. So the Forest Service, a while ago, rewrote, but under the Obama administration, wrote some strategic policies and guidance that basically say, we want you to consider climate change in your planning. We want you to consider both opportunities for forests to support climate change mitigation and also how you're going to do climate change adaptation given the resources and services that these lands provide. And I know if you're thinking right now, well, this is going to go away because our current administration's not super into climate change. I can assure you it's not. There are laws that require this, and so the administration would have to put a lot of energy into changing the regulations, which they could do. Congress could change some of the laws, but the courts have established that climate change is something you have to consider in environmental impact assessment, and it is the best available science. And so you're not going to be able to ignore it. You might see agency people start talking more about drought and weather variability if they get that direction, but this is still going to be relevant. So Thomas Timberlake, my PhD student who started here a year and a half ago, we got some seed funding from the college and from the Rocky Mountain Research Station to start looking into climate change planning. And so Thomas did some interviews to understand challenges of using this information to inform planning and how to operationalize concepts of resilience. We worked with Dr. Linda Joyce from the research station and led a workshop on how you plan for natural range of variation in the context of climate change over for Region 4 in Ogden. And then Thomas, out of our class project, also wrote a law review paper on how climate change gets built into NEPA documents and what the guidance looks like. And so all of this work really set us up well to go to the National Office of Sustainability and Climate Change. Thomas told me yesterday that the change has been removed, and it's now the Office of Sustainability and Climate. But they basically said, hey, we've been doing like 50 climate change vulnerability assessments at all these different scales across the nation. Some of them are region-wide vulnerability assessments. Some of them are watershed focused. Some of them are for single national forests. And they said, we need someone to look at this first generation of vulnerability assessments and help us figure out what's worked and what hasn't. So we got a project from them to do this. And this is forming part of Thomas's dissertation work, but essentially he's characterizing these approaches to vulnerability assessments, identifying best practices, and then through interviews, figuring out how do these get built into management and decision making and planning, And how can we improve that connection? Do we need better maps, better tools, better training? Do we need to place people in certain places? That's part of what we're trying to figure out. We also started thinking about what is resilience, how does that get operationalized, and how do you link it to NRV and climate change. And resilience is really a prime management objective for the Forest Service, but it gets used pretty inconsistently. And we got funding last year from the Joint Fire Sciences program with another team at the University of Oregon. I just like going to Eugene twice a year, so I like look around for people there. No, I just happen to build some connections with people there. But we have a great project looking at how resilience is being used in forest planning, how the meaning of this is getting co-constructed with stakeholders and agencies, what's the link to adaptation planning. And we're doing this big study with case studies and interviews. We're doing a comprehensive document analysis of how resilience gets used in planning documents, and a survey to really try to understand kind of the early areas of practice on this. So the last area that I've got research going on, and this is a newer area for me, is in fire management. So you all know that restoring natural fire regimes and reducing the cost of fire and the impacts of the fire suppression budget on the rest of the Forest Service's budget are really major priorities. And so one of the things I've been wanting to do for a while is look at the barriers to doing more prescribed fire. And there's been a lot of research on the social barriers and trust, and do communities trust the Forest Service. And there's been some surveys on prescribed fire barriers, and people will say it's air quality regulations, or it's NEPA, or it's the Endangered Species Act. But they're not up to date, and we don't really know what it is about those laws that's actually getting in the way, and we don't actually know where we can move the needle, like what's actually changeable. And we don't know what things like the, air quality is done under the Clean Air Act, and every state has their own state implementation plan. We don't know, like, where is this, like, states deciding to be more aggressive, or individual air quality regulators who are risk averse. We just don't really know what this landscape looks like. And so we have a new project really looking at the policy and regulatory barriers around prescribed fire. I'm just getting started, but I'm working with some people at a law school who are doing a legal analysis across the 11 western states. We're going to do a lot of interviews with staff with the Forest Service. We're also looking at the BLM for this project and air quality regulators at departments of environmental quality to understand what's really going on. We're going to do case studies where we can see people have actually increased their accomplishments and figure out how they've done that. And then at the end of all this, we're going to go to high-level policymakers and say, here are the things we've identified that are real barriers. What could we actually change? Where do we actually have some possibility of changing law or regulation? Where is there any political space for that? Some early things that I'm finding, so we just got started on this, but I will say there are some states that are getting a lot more done, and one of the things we're finding is that a major problem is just the disconnect in governance of air quality regulators sitting in one office thinking about that resource, and land managers sitting elsewhere. There's a interesting finding that in the Southeast, where we get more burning done, that those people are often housed in a single natural resource agency. And I'm already starting to see some of that in my findings across the West, that where the Forest Service has someone sitting at DEQ or vice versa, they have more mutual understanding and they get better stuff done. And so I'm really interested to find out more about this. I'm also finding out that air quality is not actually what it comes down to. It's more of a challenge that people are anticipating in a lot of locations. So we'll see. And then I'm also working on sort of a broader institutional analysis of fire management in the Forest Service. A last project just thought I'd mention quickly is that we also got Joint Fire Science funding to do this participatory assessment. It's kind of an iterative process of science delivery. So I'm partnering with someone who models what climate is going to do to future fire in Alaska, both the effects for fire regimes, but also for vegetation. And vegetation's really critical for a lot of different reasons, maybe in terms of its flammability. Sometimes it's really critical for caribou or moose habitat that communities rely on. So we're sort of taking these projections about future fire to managers and saying, what are you going to do about this, right? And then they might say, you know what, we're going to try to change management in these ways. Here's some ideas. And then we feed those back into the models and say, okay, this is what we predict would happen based on that. Do you still like it? What else would you want to try? And so we're trying to do this process to help managers think about some of their future options and then what they would actually need to deal with fire in the future. And so are they going to need policy change? Are they going to need governance change? Are they going to need way more resources? If they don't get them, what are they going to do? And then we'll do some policy communication on their behalf. And this work is what my student Tate Rutherford's working on. He's just starting on interviews with fire managers. So some future things that I'm really excited about. I'm just still really interested in are there any ways we can move beyond incremental institutional change? Are there strategies for more transformative institutional change? Can we think about what that would look like and figure out how society might organize to get there? I'm really interested in this question as we move towards focusing on our forests more for climate change, how we balance managing forests for adaptation to climate change versus for climate change mitigation. And are there certain places where that's in competition, and are there places where you would prioritize one or the other? I think this is a really interesting question and what it will mean for forest management. I'm also interested in doing some comparative analysis of governance systems where we have similar challenges and similar jurisdictional complexity, but different legal frameworks, maybe different administrative law. So I was just in India talking to people about potentially designing a study to look at the use of science and the different ways that you can compel agencies to use current science. And their administrative law system is fundamentally different there. And for a long time, I've been interested in doing some analysis across different countries where we have different administrative legal systems and different court systems. Some countries have science courts, and looking at how that affects how science gets integrated into conservation and planning. And then this issue of multi-level governance, it's important around the world, but it's really this question of where you have these mixed jurisdiction landscapes where we're trying to manage at larger scales. You might have governance for this chunk of state managed land and this chunk of federal land and this group of private landowners, but who's taking the big picture, right? Who's organizing them? Who's saying, is this working? Do we have the right mix of incentives? And that's where you might need some multi-level governance institutions. And we don't know a lot about what they might look like in design. And so that's something I'm really interested in working on in the future. So that's all I have today, and I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts and also talk with you more in the future. That's part of what I wanted to do, was tell you all about my program so we could have some interesting dialogue about how we might collaborate and work together on some of these questions going forward. Thanks. Mike?
But I find it interesting working with natural range of variation and climate change, because in some sense, climate change almost makes natural range of variation almost a extinct concept, because the variation is changing. We don't know really how much. So how do you try to work with that concept?
Yeah, so like I said earlier, you could think about natural range of variation. You can really think about landscapes where we know we're really outside of NRV and where natural processes aren't functioning. And so we know things like fire, when we have natural fire regimes, allow forest ecosystems to track climate and climatic change effectively. And so if you have a landscape where fire regimes can't operate naturally, then they are not going to effectively move with climate change, right? And so part of what I think about is not trying to engineer these systems to like 1853 or something. It's just, are there places where we maybe need to sort of set the clock ticking again by getting natural processes working, and then kind of help ecosystems be on a better path where we have impaired that through some management choice. I also think it depends on the scale you look at. So if you're thinking about NRV on a 10,000 year time scale over a whole mountain range, that gives you a lot more flexibility. So I've really encouraged managers to not get too stuck on like NRV at a certain time, to see it as having more flexibility, but it's something that anchors us to it's better than just resilience, because you could really have something undesirable or non-natural or really degraded that's very resilient. And so if we couple the concepts, then I think we get more towards what we want for some of our lands. Other questions? Yeah, Kevin?
I was interested in your comment that putting triggers in really seems to spur action. How much do you have to integrate psychology, and how much can it be and should it be integrated into policy? Because it seems like if you have a policy that doesn't work with the way people think, it's not going to be effective, whereas something like a trigger, like the key insights is really important.
Yeah, so let me just talk about triggers first. The triggers thing is a way, so adaptive management, for example, got built into habitat conservation planning under the Endangered Species Act. And it was a way to say, we're just going to keep doing what we're doing, but if we monitor and detect a problem, we'll fix it. And people started to say, well, you don't have any money for monitoring, you don't have any public oversight, and you're not promising us when you're going to actually decide there's a problem and fix it. And so maybe we'd swung too far towards flexibility and not balanced it with accountability. And what triggers do is they hopefully give you some kind of like model about how we're going to respond when we see X, Y, or Z. It's like a note to future managers. It's a commitment to your current stakeholders. And they're not necessarily very enforceable, but they're important to have in there. So like on the Pinedale, they said when we see whatever, 20% decline in the mule deer herd compared to reference conditions, we're going to stop and change something, right? And that's the kind of way that triggers will get used. So I'm not sure about the link to that to your psychology question, but I will say that when you look at institutional frameworks for barriers to innovation taking place or to change, the social psychological research will come in there, and it'll say, if something is so outside people's mental models or norms and culture, or what we find socially acceptable in terms of what government should and shouldn't be doing, it's not going to be very successful. And if we want to do it anyway, then we need to figure out what kinds of processes are we going to do to sort of change how people think about these problems. And so, that's somewhere where I think there's a lot of potential to collaborate with people from those disciplines. Yeah?
I want to talk about ecosystem management and how that term's kind of changed into resilience and restoration. Why do you think the term ecosystem management just didn't have that lifespan?
Yeah.
You have to switch out the term, and is there going to be something new that's the same concept?
Yeah. Well, I will say that in Science this week, there was an article that said, ecosystem management is a wicked problem. And I was like, Jesus, I could have published that in Science, like it's not a new scientific discovery. So people are still talking about it. It kind of depends on where you are. So, like Rebecca was here, she works on marine governance, and it's used a lot, ecosystem-based management in that field. And I think about it largely in sort of saying, we're going to work at ecosystem scales, but we have to think carefully about, if we say we're going to manage at a large protected area scale instead of a local scale, then we have implications for governance, right? And so it's still really relevant. For the Forest Service, the term got sort of utilized as a policy priority, ecosystem management, and people didn't feel like it really became reality, and that some people didn't feel like it incorporated the stakeholder input as much as it needed to, and some people felt like it was just kind of a new lingo for the same thing, sort of old wine in new bottles. And so I think that the language has evolved to try to capture more what we're trying to do, and we're thinking much more about restoration and resilience because the change that we're seeing is becoming much more obvious and salient since like 2000 or so. So yeah. Did you have a question?
Yeah, do you work with situations where there are multiple agencies adjacent to each other? For example, you might have Rocky Mountain National Park, Department of Interior surrounded by the Forest Service. It just seems like these agencies have different policies and laws and programs, and they don't really talk.
Yeah. So our new project where we're looking at that kind of companion program between the Natural Resource Conservation Service and the Forest Service is one of the first where we're actually going to do a systematic analysis of that. And in our prescribed fire work, we're getting at that. But that's somewhere I'm really interested in going. But a lot of my work's been much more Forest Service focused so far. But I did hear today that program, this is hilarious. So the program of the Natural Resource Conservation Service and the Forest Service actually work combining budgets and working together. I was like, how did this start? And these guys told me, well, it was during the shutdown of 2013, and the two chiefs were like, had nothing to do. And so they went out and had beers, and they were like, hey, we should work together. And then they came up with I love that. So, yeah. Anything else? Yeah.
From a policy perspective, do you see any movement towards a sort of non-biased or quantitative use of the term resilience?
Well, there's definitely, okay, so that's a complicated question. So there's definitely people who are trying to figure out how can we measure resilience in different types of systems, right? And what would it look like if we're talking primarily about ecological resilience. If you're talking more about social ecological resilience, so social scientists don't like resilience for communities all the time because we often as a society want social change, right? And so if you think about resilience meaning maintaining a social structure function in light of disturbance, it's like, what does that mean, you know? So would you say a community like Moab's resilient because it's persisted economically, but all the jobs have changed in nature? You know, do we want resilience or do we want more movement and social change? What societies want from ecosystems is constantly changing. And so when you start thinking about social ecological resilience, it becomes much more of like a co-negotiated concept. So I think to answer your question, yes, people are trying to figure out how do we measure ecological resilience on ecosystems. But in terms of social ecological resilience, and you know, I think there's other people who work on that more in forest management. It's much more about like, what do we even mean by that right now? Yeah, yeah.
In projects, management projects that emphasize adaptive management, is there much evidence that those actually do evolve a lot over time? You mentioned when the Endangered Species Act comes into play, but there are other cases where it's effectively management evolves or doesn't.
Yeah, no, there's not a lot of successful examples of adaptive management being built into planning on Forest Service lands. Our institutions aren't really well set up to support it, but I think that the CFLRP is almost like an incubator in the sense that those projects are starting to collect data, and they have it's like you have like a collaborative restoration marriage for like 15 years. You have to figure out how you're going to stay working together. And so I think they're starting to collect that data and ask some of these questions. How do we feed this back into planning? And is it in the same planning documents or new ones? And what does this information tell us? And is it what we wanted? And so I think we're starting to see more evolution in that direction. Big picture, we see adaptation and change, but adaptive management in the sense that we got data on how this worked and reintegrated it into planning, that's less common. We are seeing some of those projects actually try different treatments on paired landscapes and compare how different treatments are working to meet restoration goals. So I think that's kind of a promising thing too. And then I would just say in the Rocky Mountain National Park, you know, scientists here at CSU really help them design their adaptive management plan, and it's one of the best examples of where you actually have monitoring with controls, so you can say something about causality and then adapt your management accordingly. Yeah. It's hot in here, yeah. I know it's.
So back in the 80s, Doug Rideout sort of stirred things up by claiming that
I can't believe that.
most land managers' objective function was to maximize their budget. So can you reflect on that concept? And I was interested in how you were talking about how the CFLR budget is changing.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a lot of literature that shows that organizations over time want to grow and maximize their budgets, and that's sort of the nature of organizations as a whole. And that especially if you're in leadership positions, you know, no matter what you want to do, you want to show success and get more money to do that, right? And so I think that there's this kind of natural incentive to grow and to augment your budgets. But like, whether or not that's happening at the individual level, that's less likely. I think that's more something that you tend to see like in line officers and in leadership who are sort of thinking about long-term agency viability and not losing opportunities that they might, you know, especially as your budget's declining and you're going through, you know, sequesters and various forms of rescission. I think you don't want to like lose more money to do the important work. So, and there's a lot of evidence that as you have financial incentives, of course, you're going to take them and do things that keep getting you money.
I mean, you kind of portrayed a picture where the budget allocation forced people to sort of sit around the table and work together.
Yeah.
So can it be sort of a more collective optimization?
Yeah, I think so. And you know, one of the things I've learned about the Forest Service, you've got 35,000 employees, there's no homogeneity, right? Like you have a lot of people who want to do a lot of different things and a lot of different personalities and generations and different incentives throughout the organization. And so, yes, I think when you sit people around the table, a lot of times what people on the ground are thinking about is how can we do good landscape level restoration, management, projects. But they're also thinking, oh, if I don't meet these targets, I'm not going to get money the next year, and so I have to meet these targets, you know. And they might then go work some back doors and say, we need to tweak these targets because they're incentivizing the wrong stuff. But you're not going to freely give up your budget because you know someone else is going to get it if you don't kind of maintain that goodwill with your principals that pay you to do that work, right? Or at least give you the money to do the work. Yeah.
I'm just amazed by the CFLRP work that's going on, and then we work in the planning room shop of that lessons learned. I always struggle why the agency internally doesn't get that, leverage that to the planning room, because in the CFLRP work, it's mandated, it's getting done, there's great examples of all this, how they operation like the constructs, so that it just baffles me. So is that something you would like to research?
Yeah, no, I think absolutely. Like this, CFLRP has been like an incubator on how we do large-scale planning, how we do monitoring, what monitoring means. People are learning by doing it. How we improve the way we do contracting, how we operationalize restoration, right? Desired future conditions. I mean, it's all of these things people are doing, right? So I think there's a ton of stuff you could gather from that, and I think some of that's diffusing naturally at the local level, but. I'm not sure to what extent you could say these are the lessons learned and then turn around and impose them, right? It's like so much of that is learning by doing, and then people coming out of it and saying, I know how to do monitoring, and I know why I need a control over here if I want to monitor this. And so yes, I think it's really an interesting thing, but I wonder, like, is it something you could study and tell everyone about, or do we have to sort of let that happen organically? We can talk about it over beer, Dan.
Okay.
Okay.
And I have the money to fund the research, but I'm just trying to
Yeah. Sarah.
Just to add one point to the process, the CFLRPs are able to do that because they got a big chunk of change.
Yeah.
That other places aren't, and it is going to go away. So it's not as simple as just saying.
But I struggle with giving guidance to people that are doing forest planning, and they're struggling with the same type of concepts and things. And they're like, I don't know where to start. I'm like, well, look at this program they did in 1 year. They set up their collaborators. They set up their, so that's what I'm thinking about. Like, why hasn't that transferred into the planning shop?
I do think you as an agency are working on this and have a lot of space to grow your ability to like capture lessons learned more systematically and build in the time to do that. But that's a direct competition with your budgets and capacity declining, right? So you have these really complex laws, a lot of work to do, less people, less money, and you have a real need to find a way to do organizational learning in that. And so I know you guys in EMC are really trying to find ways to do that. And I think that's really critical and something to think about going forward is how do we keep promoting that kind of learning culture. Okay, I know we're out of time, so thanks everybody, and I'm happy to chat more